The building of Rome. There once reigned in a town called Alba in Italy a king whose name was Numitor. He had a brother called Amulius, who was a proud and wicked man and could not bear that his elder brother should be king over him. So Amulius plotted against his brother. He got together a number of men who were as bad and cruel as himself, and they attacked Numitor and drove him from his home and made Amulius king in his stead. They took the sons of Numitor and his daughter Rhea, Silvia, and killed them. Then Amulius seized the two little sons of Rhea Silvia, who were still only babies. He gave them to his soldiers and told them to throw the poor little boys into the river Tiber. Then thought he, "They will be drowned. There will be none of my brother's children left to trouble me, and I shall be king all my life." The soldiers took the two babies in their cradle lying side by side, fast asleep, and carried them to the river. Now there had been a great deal of rain, and the Tiber had overflowed its banks, so that the men could not put the children in the deep part of the river, but only at the edge, where the water was shallow. However, they thought that they would have obeyed the orders of the Amulius if they left the little boys there. So they put the cradle down in the water and went away. The sun was shining, and the waters were sinking fast. Soon the dry land began to show itself. The cradle stood still, and the waters left it on the bank and ran back into their bed. There lived not far from the Tiber a shepherd whose name was Faustulus. He was walking by the side of the river when he saw a cradle lying under a fig tree, and beside the cradle stood a great she-wolf. Faustulus was very astonished and ran quickly to see what this might mean. When he got near, he saw that in the cradle were two beautiful little baby boys, and the wolf was feeding them with her milk, just as if they had been her own little ones. But when she saw Faustulus, she fled away into the woods, and he took the children and carried them home to his wife. So these two kind people loved the boys and brought them up like their own sons, Romulus and Remus. So the boys were called, grew up strong and bold and active. They did not care to till the ground and herd the cattle, but loved to hunt in the woods and mountains. Sometimes, too, they would attack the robbers whom they met in that wild land and take their plunder from them. So it happened that many young men from the country round came to them and joined their expeditions, and of these Romulus and Remus were always the chiefs and leaders. Faustulus had heard that two grandsons of the king had been thrown into the Tiber, and he guessed that these must be the boys he had found when Numitor, their old grandfather, heard of these two young men. He too thought they must be his daughter's sons. Then Romulus and Remus took their friends and companions with them and went to Alba. They attacked King Amulius and killed him. When Numitor heard of what had happened, he called the Alban nobles together and told them of all the wrongs he had been borne from his brother and all the story of his grandsons while he was still speaking. The two brothers marched with their followers into the midst of the assembly, and they hailed their grandfather as King of Alba, to the great joy of all the Alban people. Now Romulus and Remus were not content to stay at Alba with their old grandfather, but they determined to build a new city for themselves. They made up their minds that this new city should be near the river Tiber, on the spot where they were found by Faustulus when they were little babies. So they took their companions with them and went to that place. There was still growing the fig tree under which their cradle had lain, and they resolved that they would build their walls there and leave the fig tree standing in the midst for hundreds of years afterwards. The fig tree was to be seen standing in one of the chief streets of Rome. The walls were soon begun, but while they were building, the two young men began to quarrel. Remus spoke scornfully to his brother and laughed at him, and jumped over the wall that Romulus had just begun to raise. Romulus was very angry, and in his rage he struck his brother and killed him. Thus he became the only leader and king. He finished building the city, which he called Rome after his own name. He ruled it for many years, and after his death, the Romans worshipped him as a god. Chapter 1. The Horatii and the Curiazi. In the reign of King Tullus Hostilius there was a quarrel between the people of Rome and the people of Alba. The Romans and the Albans were generally very friendly to each other. They were of the same race. Their way of living was the same, and they spoke the same language. Some of the Romans had married Alban women, and some of the Albans had married Roman women, so that each people had friends and relations in the other town. But now there was a quarrel between them, and the Roman army, with King Tullus at its head, marched out to meet the Albans, who were commanded by their dictator, Medius Futhetius. When the armies came near together, the Alban dictator sent a messenger to King Tullus. The messenger came to the Roman army and was led before the king, who was preparing himself for the battle. Now Tullus was a brave warrior. He was young and strong and eager to win glory in war, but still he was wise, and he did not refuse to listen to the message of Marius. "O Tullus," said the messenger, "I am sent to you by the dictator of the Albans. He bids me tell you that it will be much for the good of Rome as well as for the good of Alba, if you will come out in front of your army and speak with him before the fight begins." Tullus agreed to do as Marius asked. The two armies took their places, and all was made ready for battle. And then Medius and Tullus, followed by some other nobles, advanced midway between the armies, and Medius spoke these words: "Hear me, King Tullus, and you, nobles of Rome. It seems to me that the only cause of our quarrel is that we know not whether Rome or Alba is the stronger, and which town shall be the master of the other. Can we not decide this in some other way than by the death of all the brave men who must be slain if we begin to fight?" The thought pleased King Tullus, and after consulting together, they fixed upon a plan. It was agreed that 3 Romans should fight against 3 Albans, and that if the Romans conquered, Rome should govern Alba, but if the Albans were victorious, then Alba should govern Rome. It happened that in the Roman army there were 3 brothers called Horatius, all strong men and brave soldiers. They were the sons of an old Roman named Publius Horatius, who had taught them, as Roman fathers in those days taught their sons, that they ought to be ready to die for the good of their people and their dear city of Rome. That was the first duty of every Roman, and you shall hear how the Horatii kept their fathers saying. The Roman army felt that they could choose no better champions than these 3 brothers, and the Horatii proudly and gladly agreed to fight, and each in his heart resolved to do his very best to save his country from being subject to Alba. Now, in the Alban army, there were also 3 brothers whose name was Horatius. They too were good soldiers, and their countrymen chose them to fight for Alba. These 3 brothers were friends of the Horatii, such dear friends that one of them had promised to marry the sister of Horatius. But they loved their town of Alba, and like the Romans, they felt that they must lose their own lives or take those of their friends for the sake of their country. When the Roman king and the Alban dictator had promised solemnly that Rome and Alba should keep the agreement, the 3 brothers on each side took their weapons and marched out between the 2 armies. The soldiers of both towns sat down on each side to watch the fight with anxious hearts, knowing that the fate of their country depended on the courage and skill of those few men. At first the battle seemed very equal, for the 6 were all good soldiers and full of bravery. Their hearts were set on winning the victory, and they were not thinking of the wounds or death that they might suffer in the struggle. But soon it seemed that the Albans were getting the better, for 2 of the Romans were killed. But the Albans were all wounded. The Alban army shouted for joy. They thought their victory was won as they saw the 3 Curiaci surround the one Horatius, who was still alive and unhurt. But cries of anger broke from the Romans when they saw their last champion turn and fly from his enemies. "Shame on the coward," they cried. "The name of Horatius is disgraced forever. Better he had died gloriously, doing his duty like his brothers." But they soon saw that Horatius was no coward, and that his flight was only a way to separate the 3 Albans, who altogether would have been more than a match for him. Horatius knew that all the Curiaci were wounded. As he fled, they followed him, and soon the one who was least wounded came up to him. Horatius turned instantly to attack him. The combat was fierce and lasted for some time. The Roman and Alban armies eagerly watched the 2 champions, and the 2 other Curiaci tried hard to reach their brother to help him, but they were wounded and could not move fast, and before they could come up, they saw their brother fall. Still they came forward. The one who was least wounded hastened on, and Horatius, joyful with his victory, stepped out to meet him. The Alban, bleeding and out of breath with the haste he had made, had no chance with the conqueror. And the 3rd brother, dragging himself on with difficulty, yet with no thought of yielding, saw him die and knew that he was left alone. Then Horatius sprang forward to meet him, crying out, "2 of these brothers have died by my hand." Now the Third shall follow them, that Rome may rule over Alba." Having said this, he stabbed Quiritus, and so died the last of the Alban brothers. When the Romans saw that their enemies were slain, they shouted for joy, and Medius, the Alban dictator, came to King Tullus and asked him if he had had any commands for him, for he remembered the agreement that had been made between them before the fight began. Tullus told him to take his army safely back to Alba, but he said that the Albans must keep themselves ready to help him in war if he should want them. So the armies departed to their homes after having buried the 5 brothers who had fallen. The graves of the 2 Romans were together. Those of the Albans were separate in the places where they died. Hundreds of years afterwards, their tombs were still to be seen. Great was the joy in Rome when news came from the camp that Horatius was victorious. The people decked their houses with garlands and hung them with bright-colored cloths, and came in crowds flocking to see the brave man who had saved Rome. The army marched in at the gate of the city, and in the front came Horatius, carrying in his hands the swords of the 3 cuirassiers, and wearing on his shoulders the mantle that one of them had worn. And the people cried to the gods to bless their champion, and the women threw flowers and laurel boughs on his helmet and under his feet as he went along. But there was one person in Rome whose heart was sad that day, and that was the sister of Horatius, when she heard that her brother had killed the man who was in a little while to have been her husband. In her grief and despair, she ran out to meet Horatius with her head uncovered and her hair loose on her shoulders, and when she met him she saw that he was wearing the mantle that she herself had embroidered and given to Curiosius. Then, in a voice of sorrow, she called out the name of Curiosius and told Horatius that he was a cruel brother to her because he had killed the man she loved so well. The words she said made Horatius very angry. "What?" cried he. "Do you forget your 2 brothers who are dead, and your brother who is still alive, and your country which I have this day saved?" Then in his rage he drew his sword and stabbed his sister to the heart so that she died, saying, "So may it be done to every maid who is a Roman and weeps for the death of an enemy." The people of Rome were very much shocked at what Horatius had done, and they took him and led him before the king, who then spoke to the people and said, "I will choose 2 judges to judge this man and to say what shall be done to him." And so he did. Then the judges said that Horatius must be slain, but he cried out and said, "Let me be tried by the whole people, and let them say if I deserve to be punished." So the king called the people to meet together to try Horatius for having killed his sister. And when the people were assembled, Horatius came before them, and with him was his old father Publius Horatius. In Rome, a father was able to do as he pleased with his son, even after the son had grown up to be a man. He could sell him as a slave, or put him to death, or punish him in any way he chose. But Publius Horatius did not wish to give his son a severe punishment, for he thought that his daughter deserved to die. The father and the son were of the same temper. They loved their country better than they loved their family. The old man stood up before the people and spoke to them. "My daughter," said he, "has been rightly punished, for she forgot her duty and loved a stranger better than she loved Rome. Do not take away from me my last child, but remember that I have already lost 2 brave sons who died in battle for their country." Then he threw one arm round his son, and pointing with the other hand to the armor and weapons of the cuirassiers, which had been hung up on a pillar in the open square where the people were met, "O Romans," he cried, "could you bear to see this young man die shamefully, whom you saw a little while ago marching as a victor through the streets of Rome? Would you chain these hands which have just won freedom and empire for the Roman people? Where was Eucalyptus inside the walls, where you see the spoils and weapons which he won from your enemies, or outside the city, inside of the graves where the cuirassiers lie buried?" The people were sorry to see his father's tears, and were surprised that Horatius himself showed no fear of death. They wondered at his courage, and remembered that he had saved them from being subjects of Alba. And they said, "We will pardon Horatius. Because he has done such great things for the good town of Rome, Brutus and his sons, the last king who reigned in Rome was called Tarquin the Proud. The Romans hated him because of his pride and cruelty, and at last, his wickedness and the wickedness of his sons enraged the people so much that they rose against him and drove him and all his family away from Rome. The people resolved that they would never more have a king to govern them, but that they would choose two of the best and bravest nobles of Rome to be their rulers. These two chiefs were called consuls, and they were to govern the city for 1 year only, after which new consuls were to be chosen. The two first consuls were Collatinus Tarquinius and Lucius Junius Brutus. Both of these men had been leaders. Of the people in driving out the king, both were relations to Tarquin, and both had suffered great wrongs from him. Lucius feared that Tarquin would kill him, as he had killed others of the chief men of Rome. And for years he pretended to be so stupid and foolish that the people gave him the surname of Brutus, which means foolish. But when the people of Rome at last rose up against the wicked Tarquin, Brutus put himself at their head, and soon showed by his wise and brave conduct he had been only acting or pretending to be stupid, that he might live unharmed by the cruel King Tarquin. For a long time tried hard to get back to Rome. Among the young Roman nobles were several who had been friends of the young princes, and who would have been glad to bring the Tarquins back, for they cared more for their own amusements than that the people should be free. Two of these young nobles were Titus and Tiberius, the sons of Brutus. These young men met together one night to talk over their plans, and they wrote letters to Tarquin, telling him they were ready to help him, and sent messengers to him with the letters. But it happened that a slave named Vindicius was in the room where they met. He did not mean to watch what they were doing, but he saw them come hastily into the room with anxious faces, and feeling afraid, he hid himself behind a large chest, and so heard all that was said when they had gone away. Vindicius came out of his hiding place, and was at first greatly puzzled what to do. He was afraid to go to the consul Brutus, and to tell him that his two sons were plotting to bring King Tarquin back. At last, he determined that he would go to Valerius, a noble Roman who, from his great love for the people, was afterwards called Poplicola, which means the people's friend. So Vindicius went to Valerius and told him all his story. Valerius was very much astonished, and ordered that Vindicius should be kept safely in his house, while he himself went with as many armed friends and slaves as he could get together in a hurry to the house of one of the plotters. They broke open the doors and found the letters of King Tarquin in the room of the messengers, who had not yet started on their journey. The consuls sat to judge the people in the forum or marketplace with their lictors beside them. The lictors were the consuls' guards, and were armed with a bundle of sticks or rods in which an axe was tied up, and they punished anyone who was condemned by the consuls, either by beating him or by cutting off his head. The young men were brought before the consuls when they were accused of plotting to bring back the king, and the letters found by Valerius were read aloud. The story of the slave Vindicius had been heard. They did not dare to say that they were not guilty. The people were sorry for Brutus when they saw his sons led before him to be judged, and some said, would it not be punishment enough if the young men were banished for all their lives from Rome? Collatinus, the second consul, shed tears. Valerius did not speak a word, but Brutus looked sternly on his sons Titus and Tiberius. He said, why do you not answer to the accusation these men bring against you? 3 times he asked them this question, but still they did not dare to answer a word, for they knew they were guilty and deserved to be punished. Then Brutus turned to the lictors. You, said he, must do all the rest that has to be done. So the lictors seized the young men, tied their hands behind them, beat them with their rods, and afterwards cut off their heads. Then Brutus left his seat and went home to his own house. When King Tarquin was driven out of Rome, he went to Clusium in Etruria, where reigned a great and powerful king called Lars Porsena. Tarquin hoped that by the help of Porsena and his Etruscan allies, he might be able to conquer the people of Rome, and so make himself king again. So he came before Porsena and begged for his help. Do not allow these Romans to banish us from their city. Remember that kings should be always ready to help each other. For if the peoples of Italy see that the Romans can drive out their king without being punished for it, they too will try to get rid of their kings. For all men love freedom. Porsena listened to all that Tarquin said. He was sorry for the old man who had been obliged to fly from his kingdom, and he promised to help him. He collected a great army and, accompanied by Tarquin and his sons, marched towards Rome, hoping to be able to take it at once. He could not do, because the brave Horatius Coriolanus defended the bridge over the Tiber, and so gave the Romans time to cut it down. When Porsenna found that he could not take Rome at once as he had hoped, he determined to besiege the city, that is, to encamp his army round it and watch it well, so that no one could either go in or out, and so that no food could be brought in. He also got ships and boats to guard the river Tiber, so that no one should get into the town that way. Porsenna sent his soldiers all round the city, and they plundered the country close to the walls, so that the people were obliged to drive their flocks of sheep and herds of cattle inside Rome. One day the consul Valerius ordered that a large flock of sheep should be driven out of the town, and the Etruscan soldiers, hearing of this, came eagerly to drive them off to their camp. But Valerius laid his plans well, for he sent the brave Herminius and Spurius Larcius, who had helped Horatius to defend the bridge, each with a party of Romans, to hide themselves some little way outside. The walls the Etruscans came up and were beginning to drive off the sheep, when Valerius had the gates of Rome opened and marched out to attack them with a strong party of soldiers. As soon as Herminius heard the trumpets, which were the signal that Valerius had begun the fight, he led his men out of their hiding place and charged the Etruscans on the other side. The Etruscans would now gladly have fled away, but as they tried to go towards their camp, Spurius Larcius and his troop met them, and so surrounded and overpowered they were all killed. But still the siege went on, and as there was not much food left in the city, Porsenna began to hope that the Romans would soon be obliged to yield. There lived in Rome a young man called Caius Musius, who thought it was shameful that the Roman people should be besieged now that they were free, for said he, such a thing never happened to the city before, even when the kings governed it. And now are we to be kept prisoners within our walls by these Etruscans, whom we have so often beaten in fight? So he resolved that he would try to force his way into Porsenna's camp and do some great deed there. He went to the Senate to ask for leave to go on his expedition. Fathers, said he, I have a great wish to cross the Tiber and get into the enemy's camp, not as a robber, but because I wish to do some great deed, if the gods will allow me. The senators granted what he asked, and Musius set off, carrying his sword with him hidden under his clothes. When he arrived in the camp of the Etruscans, he found a great crowd near the tent of King Porsenna, for the soldiers were going to receive their pay. Musius saw a man in splendid garments sitting and giving orders, and thinking that this must be the king, he rushed up to him and stabbed him. But this man was not the king, but one of his nobles. Then the Etruscan soldiers seized Musius and dragged him before Porsenna. The king asked the young man who he was, and why he had killed the Etruscan. I am a Roman, answered Musius boldly. My name is Caius Musius. I wish to kill you, king. Porsenna, because you are the enemy of Rome and I am not afraid to die. Since I have not done what I meant to do, a Roman ought to be able to do and to bear great things. But I warn you, I am not alone, for I have many followers who are resolved to kill you. You must be ready at all times to fight for your life, and see that you have armed men always watching to guard you, for we, the young men of Rome, declare war against you. Look here, and see how little Romans fear pain. As he spoke, he stretched out his right hand and thrust it into the fire that was burning near. The king Porsenna was greatly astonished at the bravery of Musius. He sprang up from his throne and bade his soldiers set the young man free. You have been more cruel to yourself, Musius, than to me, he said. I set you free. Go home untouched and unharmed by any Etruscan. Since you value courage so much, said Musius, I will tell you what your threat should never have made me say. 300 young Romans have vowed to kill you. The first turn was mine, but the rest will come, one after another, until one shall succeed in killing you. When Porsenna heard this, he began to think, though he was a brave man, that he certainly would never get back to Clusium, as someone of these fierce Romans would be sure to kill him. But Musius went safely back to Rome, and after this time he was always called Scaevola, which means the left-handed because his right hand was burnt. Porsenna sent ambassadors or messengers to Rome to offer to make peace with the Romans. He tried to make them promise to let the Tarquins come back to Rome, but they would not consent to that. At last Porsenna gave up all thoughts of making Tarquin king of Rome again, and he promised to lead his army away if the Romans would give him hostages, that is, would give him some of their own people as prisoners, so that he might be quite sure They would keep the peace for fear of what he might do to these prisoners. So the Romans gave him a number of young boys and girls. Porsenna marched away, but pitched his camp again on the banks of the Tiber, not far from Rome. One day, when the Roman maidens who were Porsenna's hostages were walking beside the Tiber, one of them, whose name was Cloelia, thought how easy it would be to get across the river away from their enemies, as Horatius Coriolanus had done. She spoke to the other girls and bade them do as she did. She then plunged into the water and swam across. She was soon on the other side, followed by her companions, and it was not long before they were all once more with their friends in Rome. Porsenna was very angry when he heard that the Roman maidens had escaped. He sent at once to the consuls, bidding them to give him back his hostages, or he would not keep the peace. The Romans sent the girls back to him, for they wished honorably to keep the promises they had made. Porsenna was so much pleased with their honesty and with the courage of Cloelia that he set her free and allowed her to choose any of her companions whom she wished to take back with her to Rome. So peace was made again between the Romans and the Etruscans, and the Romans so honored the brave Cloelia that they had a statue made of her and placed it in one of the chief streets of Rome, called the Via Sacra, which means the Holy Street. Caius Marcius and his mother. There was a noble lady in Rome named Volumnia, whose husband had died, leaving her with one little son who was called Caius Marcius. Volumnia was a brave and noble woman, and she spent all her time in bringing up her son and in making him what she thought a Roman ought to be: brave, honorable, and able to bear toil and hardship. And Caius loved and honored her, and made her happy by obeying her and trying to please her in every way. But he had a proud and haughty temper, and was often fierce and even cruel to those whom he did not love in person. He was strong and active, and from his childhood he loved to learn. The use of weapons as he grew older, he practiced himself constantly in wrestling, racing, and all kinds of manly games, and thus he became so strong and skillful and swift of foot that none of the young men of Rome could compare with him. When Caius was still very young, he went out to war for the first time when Aulus Postumus led the Roman army to fight against the proud King Tarquin, and won the great victory at the Lake Cais. Marcius behaved with great bravery in this battle, and after the fight was over, the general gave him a crown of oak leaves, the reward usually given to a soldier who had saved the life of a Roman. How glad must Marcius had felt when he came back to Rome and met his mother's eyes, and knew that she was proud of her dear son. From this time Marcius was always eager to win fame in war, and he was never satisfied with what he had done, but always tried to do more and more glorious deeds. He thought himself most happy when he could return to Rome after having fought bravely, and bring his spoils and his triumphal garlands to his mother, that he might see her joy and his glory. Now a war broke out between the Romans and the Volscians, and the consul Cominius led an army against a Volscian town called Corioli and besieged it. Then, leaving part of the army with Titus Latius, a very brave old officer, Cominius went towards Antium, another Volscian town, to meet the Volscian army. While he was gone, the men of Corioli came out of their town and attacked a party of Romans who were under the command of Marcius. He and his soldiers beat back the attack of the Volscians and drove them into the city. Then Marcius cried out, "The gates are open for the conquerors as well as for the conquered." And so saying, he, with very few following him, rushed into Corioli in pursuit of the Volscians. In the town, he fought with the greatest bravery, and the Volscians could not drive him out till Lartius and his army came to help him, and so the town was taken. The Roman soldiers at once began to plunder Corioli, but Marcius told them it was shameful for them to be collecting spoil and plundering when the consul Cominius and his troops were perhaps at that very moment fighting the Volscians. He put himself at the head of those who were willing to go with him and got to the place where Cominius was, just as the battle was going to begin. Marcius begged the consul to let him fight in the place where the danger was the greatest, and the consul, admiring his courage, granted what he asked. When the battle began, Marcius charged the Volscians with such fury that he broke through their ranks, and he was in great danger and badly wounded. But the consul sent his own guards to help him, and the Volscians were put to flight. The soldiers then begged Marcius to go to his tent, that his wounds might be dressed and he might rest himself, but he only said, "It is not for conquerors to be tired." He joined them in pursuing the enemy next day. The consul made a speech to the army, and he praised the gallant deeds of Marsyas. "Of all the plunder that we have gained," he said, "we will give the 10th part to Marsyas, who has so well deserved it, and I myself wish to give him a beautiful horse to show him how much I admire his valor." Marsyas came forward before the army to answer the consul. "I must refuse the reward you offer me," he said. "I cannot take a bribe to pay my sword. I will take my one share like the other soldiers, but your horse I will accept. And besides, I will ask a boon. I have a friend among the Volscian prisoners, and I would ask for his freedom." All the army praised Marsyas for his generosity, and the consul said, "We will give to Marsyas a reward that he cannot refuse, and that is that from this day he shall be called Coriolanus, after the town of Corioli, which he won for Rome." Soon after this, there was a great famine in Rome. During the wars and troubles of the last year, the land had not been tilled and the seed corn had not been sown, so now very little corn was to be had, and the people could hardly get bread to eat. But a great deal of corn was brought from Sicily, and the Senate met to talk over the rate at which the people should be allowed to buy it, that is, how much money they must pay for it. Now Caius Marcius, or Coriolanus, as he must now be called, was, as I told you, a very proud man. He thought because he was rich and of a noble family that he was better than the poor plebeians, as the common people of Rome were called, forgetting that a poor man may be as good, and as brave as a rich one, and that a working man may love his country just as well, and be as ready to die to serve it as the greatest noble. He wished that the nobles, the patricians they were called in Rome, should have the power to govern the country as they pleased, and that the common people should have no voice in the matter. He was also very angry because some time before the Senate had allowed the people to choose some men called tribunes, who were to defend any poor man who was in trouble and in all sorts of ways to do all they could to help the plebeians against the nobles, when the Senate met to fix about selling the Sicilian corn. Coriolanus stood up and made a speech to them. If the people said he wanted this corn to be sold to them as cheaply as it used to be, let them give back to the Senate all the power it used to possess. Shall we, who could not endure to have the Tarquins ruling over us, submit to these low-born tribunes? Let us make the people give them up to us and never have another tribune in Rome. If the people want corn, let them steal it as they did 3 years ago. If they will not do as the Senate bids them, when the people heard of what Coriolanus had said, their anger was very great. Coriolanus, they cried, would make us do his will, by starving us, the people of Rome. As if we were enemies, he will take from us this foreign corn, which is our only chance of getting bread for our children, unless we give up our tribunes to him. He will either make us slaves or force us to die of hunger. They ran to attack Coriolanus, and he might have been killed, but the tribunes came between and ordered him to be tried for what he had said at first. He treated the threats of the tribunes with scorn. But the rage of the people was so great that the Senate were afraid and thought it best to punish Coriolanus rather than that there should be war in the city. So he was tried and was condemned to be banished or sent away. From Rome for all his life, the people were much delighted at this sentence, and the nobles were in the greatest distress, so that it was easy to see by men's faces to what party they belonged. He who looked glad and cheerful was a plebeian, and he who looked downcast and sad was a patrician. Coriolanus himself was the only one who did not show any grief. He was too proud to do so. He went home to his own house and bade farewell to his wife and mother, who were in the greatest sorrow. He told them they must bear this trouble patiently, and then he left them and went out of the city. He resolved that he would go to the country of the Volscians, for his anger was so great against the Romans that he hoped to be able to revenge himself on them by the help of their old enemies. So he came to Antium, where lived Tullus Aufidius, the greatest warrior among the Volscians. Coriolanus went into the house of Tullus without anyone noticing him, and sat down by the fire, covering his face with his cloak. The people of the house were much surprised when they saw him, but so grand and noble were his look and manner that they dared not speak to him or ask him any questions. At last they went to Tullus himself, who was at supper, to tell him about this stranger. Tullus rose directly and went to the unknown guest, and asked him who he was. Coriolanus stood up, uncovering his face. "I am Caius Marcius," he said, "he who has done so much to harm the Volscians. For all the hard toil and danger that I have gone through, I have no reward but the name of Coriolanus. The ungrateful and envious people of Rome have driven me away from their city. I come to ask if you will let me help you to fight against the Romans. For now, instead of loving them, I hate them, and will do my best to punish them and to fight for you." Tullus was greatly pleased to hear what Coriolanus said. "Take courage, Marcius," answered he. "We accept your offer of help, and you shall find that the Volscians will be more grateful to you than the Romans have been." From that day, Coriolanus lived in the house of Tullus, and they were friends. Not long after this, there was a quarrel between the Volscians and the Romans, and the Volscians chose Coriolanus and Tullus for their generals. It was agreed that Coriolanus should lead an army of Volscians to attack the Romans at once, and that Tullus should remain behind to collect fresh troops and to see that the Volscian towns were properly defended. The Volscians were greatly pleased with the courage and warlike skill of their new general, and they praised him. So often and so much that Tullus began to think that all his own deeds would be forgotten, and he grew jealous of Coriolanus, and wished that he had never helped him to make friends with the Volscians. News was brought to Rome that the banished Coriolanus, at the head of a large Volscanian army, was marching to attack them, and soon they heard of his taking one town after another that lay between Rome and the country of the Volscians. At last he arrived at a place only 5 miles from Rome, and then all the people were in the greatest terror. The women ran up and down the streets in their fear. The old men were seen weeping and praying before the altars of the gods, and the whole city was filled with confusion and alarm. The people in Senate agreed to send messengers to Coriolanus to beg him to put an end to the war and to ask him to come home and be a Roman once more. So they chose for messengers men who were all friends or relations of Coriolanus, supposing that he would treat with respect and kindness those whom he had loved before he was banished. But when the messengers came to the Volscian camp, they were led before Coriolanus, who was seated in state with his chief officers about him. He received them with a very severe manner, and as if they had been all strangers. To him he told them that the Romans must give back to the Volscians all the lands they had taken from them in former wars. "If you do not do this," said he, "you shall have no peace." So the messengers went back to Rome sad at heart, to tell the people of these hard terms. The Romans, in great fear, sent the messengers back again to Coriolanus, but he refused to let them come. Into his camp after this, the priests in their robes went to try if they could persuade him to show mercy, but they could not alter his resolve. He told them that the Romans must either give up their lands, as he had said, or fight now, when the Romans had almost lost the hope of being able to defend themselves against their terrible enemy. Some of the Roman ladies went to Volumnia, the mother of Coriolanus, to ask her and his wife Vigilia to go to him and to beg him to spare the city. When the ladies had spoken, Volumnia said, "All the Romans are unhappy, but we are more unhappy than all, for we see my son, Vigilia's husband, fighting against his own country. I know not if he have any love for us left, as he had none for his country, which used to be dearer to him than mother, wife, or children. But we will go to him if you wish it. If he will not listen to us, we can at least die at his feet, begging him to have mercy on Rome." So Volumnia and Vigilia took the 2 little sons of Coriolanus with them, and went with the other women to the Volscian camp. When they got there, the soldiers allowed them to pass through it till they came to where Coriolanus was sitting among his chief officers. The general, who had resisted the prayers of his dearest friends, and of the priest who begged him in the name of the gods to spare Rome, was not inclined to pay any attention to a band of sorrowing women, but one of his attendants cried out suddenly, "If my eyes do not deceive me, General, yonder stand your mother and your wife and children." Coriolanus was greatly surprised. He sprang from his seat and ran to embrace his mother. But when he came near her, she bade him, "Stop before you embrace me." She said, "Let me know if I am come to my son or to an enemy. If I am your mother or a prisoner in your camp, has my life lasted so many years, only that I should see you first banished, and now the enemy of Rome, could you plunder the country in which you were born, and which has fed you for so many years? Did not your anger grow less when you came into these parts? Did not you think when you came in sight of Rome within those walls, is my home, there are my mother, wife, and children. If you had not been born, Rome would not have been attacked. If I had never had a son, I might have died a free woman in a free country. Now what I suffer is shameful to you and most sad to me. Yet however miserable you make me, it cannot be for long. For if you go on to conquer Rome, you must pass over the dead body of your mother. Then she and his wife and children threw themselves on their knees at his feet and begged him to have mercy on Rome. Coriolanus was shocked to see his mother kneeling before him. "Oh, mother," he said as he raised her up, "what have you done? You have gained a great victory for Rome, but it will be ruinous to me. I go conquered by you alone." So he sent the ladies back to Rome, and next morning he led the Volscian army away to Antium. Some of the Volscians were very angry with Coriolanus because he had not gone on and conquered Rome. Among these was Tullus Aufidius. Tullus was also jealous of Coriolanus because his great courage and skill in war had made the Volscians think more of him than they did of Tullus. Tullus therefore resolved to kill Coriolanus and collected a number of his friends who agreed to help him. They called on Coriolanus to give an account of what he had done before Rome to the people of Antium, and when he stood up to speak, they cried out that a traitor ought not to be heard, rushed on him, and stabbed him so he died. But the Volscians gave him an honorable funeral and raised a monument to his memory. There was in Rome a great family of nobles called the Fabii. There were a great many of them, brothers, cousins, and other relations, and they were brave men and good soldiers, but proud to the people, so the commons hated them, and were very angry because the nobles year after year got one or another Fabius made consul. The people thought that one of these men, Quintus Fabius, had not divided fairly the plunder that had been taken in war from the Volscians, and for this they hated the Fabii more than ever, and they hated the nobles too, for so often making Fabii their consuls. These quarrels grew so violent that one year when Caesar Fabius was consul and led the army against the Vangians, the soldiers would not fight. Fabius had more trouble with his own soldiers than with the enemy. He was a good general and drew up his troops in order of battle, but when he commanded them to charge, the foot soldiers would not move. They hated the consul so much that they felt they would rather bear the disgrace of being beaten than help to win a victory for him. The horse soldiers, however, who were rich men and did not belong to the common people and did not hate the Fabii, charged Veientians and defeated them without the help of the foot. The nobles still would not do as the people wished, and the next year they chose Marcus Fabius Cae's brother for one consul, and Gnaeus Manlius for the other. The Etruscans were very glad when they knew how the Romans were quarreling among themselves, for now they thought Rome might be conquered, as its own people would not fight to defend it. The Roman consuls were more afraid of their own soldiers than of the enemy, and they thought the best thing that they could do was to shut themselves up in their camp, hoping that the soldiers would, after a time, change their minds and wish to fight. The Etruscans used to ride up to the gates of the camp and challenge the Romans to come out and fight them. Sometimes they would tell them that they only pretended to quarrel because they were cowards and dared not fight. Sometimes they would say that the consuls would not let them fight because they knew the Romans would be sure to be beaten. The consuls did not care or take much notice of the taunts of the enemy, but the soldiers could not bear them so well. Their hearts were filled with shame and anger, and at last they crowded to the consul's tent, begging them to give the signal for battle. The consuls were glad enough to see the change in their men, but they would not yet yield. They wished to fight, but they thought if the soldiers were kept still a little longer in the camp, that they would grow more and more eager for battle. So they spoke to the soldiers and told them that the time for attacking the enemy was not yet come, but that they would stay in the camp. The soldiers went away from the consuls thinking that they were not to be allowed to fight, and wishing to do so more than ever. The enemy too, hearing that the consuls would not fight, came up to the gates of the camp and mocked and insulted the Romans, saying that they were not to be trusted with their arms, lest they should use them against their own generals the Romans could bear it no longer, and ran in crowds to the consuls, demanding with shouts and cries to be led to battle. Marcus Fabius, having talked with Manlius, the other consul, commanded the soldiers to be silent, and then said, "I know, Manlius, that these Men can win the battle if they choose. But I know not whether they really mean to win it. So I have resolved not to give the signal for battle unless they swear that they will come back conquerors, for they will not dare to disappoint the gods. One of the centurions or officers, called Flavolius, came forward and said, Fabius, I swear that I will come back a conqueror from the fight if I do not. May the gods punish me. All the rest of the soldiers made the same promise, and when this was done, Fabius gave the signal, and the army marched out of the camp full of hope and shouting to the Etruscans. Now let us see if you dare call us cowards again. The Etruscans were eager for battle, thinking that the Romans would not really fight, but they soon found that they were mistaken. For they had hardly time to get into order before the Romans rushed upon them sword in hand. The people and the nobles all thought well that day, but the Fabii fought best of all, and gave a noble example for their countrymen to follow. One of them, Quintus Fabius, was in front of the Roman army, and he attacked the enemy so fiercely that he was separated from his own men and surrounded by his foes. An Etruscan stabbed him with his spear, and he sank down and died. The fall of this brave man made the Romans stop, then begin to go back. But Marcus Fabius, the consul, stepped across his brother's body and cried out to the soldiers, Was this what you promised me, fellow soldiers? Did you swear that you would come back beaten to the camp? I made no promise, but now I swear. I will either win the battle or else die at your side, dear Quintus Fabius. Then, who had been consul the year before, stepped up to the side of Marcus. Thank you, brother, said he, that you can make these men fight by talking to them. Instead of telling them, let us show them what to do as is fitting for brave men and men of the Fabian race. When he had said these words, the two Fabii at once attacked the enemy at once, and they were followed by the whole army. Meanwhile, Manlius, the other consul, had been so badly wounded in another part of the battle that he was obliged to go out of the fight that his wounds might be bound up. This made his soldiers lose heart. They thought he was killed, and were beginning to give way when the consul Fabius rode up to them with some of his horse soldiers and called to them that he had conquered the other wing of the Etruscans and that Manlius was not dead but only wounded. This cheered them, and soon after, to their great joy, Manlius came back to the battle. Meanwhile, the Etruscans, who were many more in numbers than the Romans, sent a body of troops to attack the Roman camp, which they did so fiercely that they broke into it, though the Roman guards defended it bravely. News was brought to Manlius of what had happened, and he immediately came to the camp and set a guard of soldiers at each gate to prevent the enemy getting out. They tried hard to break through, and in the fight, Manlius was killed. The Etruscans managed to get through the gate, but as they marched away, they were met by the consul Fabius and his conquering army, and many of them were killed and the rest put to flight. Thus the Romans had gained a splendid victory, though it was saddened by the deaths of Quintus Fabius and of the consul Manlius. The Senate were very glad to hear of the battle being won, and they sent word to Marcus Fabius that he should enter the city and triumph with his army. But Fabius answered, My family are all in tears and grief for the death of my brother Quintus, and Rome is mourning for her consul, so I will not wear the laurel wreath nor come home in triumph. This refusal of Fabius was thought by the people more glorious than any triumph could have been. Splendid funerals were made for the two dead chiefs, and Fabius made speeches at the graves and gave them the praise that they deserved for so bravely dying for Rome. Fabius did not forget that he had determined when he was first made consul to make the people friends again with the nobles. One of the things he did to bring this about was to plan that the nobles should give money to feed and clothe the poor. Soldiers who had been badly wounded in the war, and none of these soldiers were better taken care of than those who were the charge of the Fabian family. By these and other brave and kind deeds, the Fabii made the people love them and forget their old dislike. Soon afterwards, new wars began with several peoples round Rome, but the most troublesome enemies of all were the Veientians. Then the Fabian family went to the Senate, and Caeso, who was consul again that year, spoke for all the rest, saying, It is well known to you that to fight the Veientians, a small number of soldiers always ready would be more useful than a larger number who would only be sometimes watching them. Do you attend to the other wars, but give the war against Veii to the care of the Fabian family. We promise you that we will not disgrace the name of Rome, and we will pay the cost of the war ourselves." The Senate thanked the brave Fabii, and the consul with his family returned to their homes next day. All the Fabii armed themselves and met, together in front of the consul's house. The consul saw all his family drawn up in order of battle, and he went out clad in his armor and joined them. He gave the signal to start, and they all, 306 in number, all nobles, all of one family, and each man fit to be a general, marched through the city to the gate nearest to Veii. They were followed by crowds of people praising them, admiring them, and bidding them go on bravely and fight successfully. So the Fabii left Rome and marched on till they came to the river Cremera, where they built themselves a strong fort or castle, and there they watched the Veientians. They were so strong and brave that they kept their fort safe and defended the country which borders on Etruria, and troubled the Etruscans greatly for some time. The Etruscans got together an army and attacked the castle, but the Romans sallied out and drove off the enemy, and afterwards defeated them in several other battles. The Etruscans began to think that they could never conquer these fierce Fabii in open fight, so they made a plan to attack them unexpectedly. A number of Etruscan soldiers hid themselves, not far from the castle. Then some others drove a flock of sheep out onto the plain further away from it. When the Fabii saw the sheep, they went out to catch them, and in doing so, they passed the place where the Etruscans were hidden. Then they scattered themselves about the plain in pursuit of the sheep, and suddenly met some Etruscan troops who had been sent to attack them at the same time. The Etruscans who had been hidden rushed upon them from behind, so that they were quite surrounded. The Fabii fought nobly, as you may fancy from what you have heard of their deeds, but they were few and the Etruscans were many, and they were killed every one of them except one young boy. Chapter 6.